So thanks for coming to do this. I was thinking about how I would introduce him, and I brought these two things into the studio. And basically, if I was to think of my friendship with Robert, it would be these things. For the uninitiated, these are railway clips. They clip rails to sleepers. And why do these remind me or symbolize our friendship? I had a preview tour of phase 1 of the High Line, so from Gansevoort to 23rd Street, the first one, right? 20. And anyway, you know, I was with my husband, and Robert was like, so what do you think? You know, being British, the emotional spectrum is 0 to 0.5. So I was like, yeah, it's okay. I mean, you did a good job. And I said, it lacks a little authenticity. He was like, what do you mean? I said, the rails aren't clipped to the sleepers. And ever since then, he has not let me forget it. So every year I get one of these mailed to me. I know what it is. So my advice is just be careful what you say to Robert, because he will never forget. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm very sensitive, so be careful on the Q&A. Thanks, Adam, for having me. What I thought I'd do is go through a little bit of the history of the High Line, talk a little bit about how we sort of turned this, what was then maybe a crazy idea, into reality, and then talk about sort of the future, where we're going forward. One, we're not done, and there's a lot of other things that we're focused on right now. So, I mean, y'all all know the High Line, so I'm going to go really quickly through the parts y'all know. You know, it's a 1.5 mile rail line on the west side of Manhattan. But what you might not have known is the history. So the trains used to run down 10th Avenue, and it was called Death Avenue because so many people were run over, if you can just imagine what this looked and smelled like, and the train, you know, running over people, that the railroad, New York Central, hired a guy on horseback to ride in front of the train, and he got nicknamed the West Side Cowboy. And this is a picture taken in 1934. You can see the track had just been built. This is at 17th and 10th Avenue. But I don't know if the cowboy wasn't that good or it just didn't work, but about one person was still killed every month. So they decided to elevate it, and this is a picture of it under construction. This is on 30th Street. This is the old Miller Highway, which was where the West Side Highway is. It was elevated. And this was torn down in the 80s. This was still here. And so there were these two sort of steel structures, one for cars, one for trains. And they were built almost at the same time. Here's a great picture with the Empire State Building. The Empire State Building was finished at the same time the High Line was. So, you know, sometimes I think of the High Line as so old and it's this industrial artifact, but really, you know, it's my dad's age. So it's not, it's ancient for industrial history, but it's not sort of an ancient artifact of New York. So here's a picture right after it was completed, running through Chelsea. So this is where the old Roxy was. This is the kitchen, you know, London Terrace. You can still see, again, the trains running down 10th Avenue. And it was always a freight train. It was never a passenger train or an L. And it ran, originally ran all the way down to Houston Street. And it serviced a lot of the warehouses along the way. This building was the old R.C. Williams. This is now the Avenues School. It's the new school. That was actually the first building that got something loaded from the High Line. And it was elevated partly because to load and unload in this industrial area, but also because this area was built on landfill. The High Line, the rail line continued north, and above 34th Street, it went underground. And so that's how they built Riverside Park, was over those train lines. And if you take the Empire Line to Albany today, you're going on those same tracks that the High Line used to run on. So here it is running through what was then the old Bell Labs building, what's now West Beth. So you can see, you know, now it no longer goes this. You can still see this little piece that's still there. And this part was demolished in the 90s. That's now the West Coast building. Those little holes where the trains used to run through are now apartments. But with the rise of interstate trucking, it was used less and less. And the last train was a trainload of frozen turkeys at Thanksgiving in 1980, or that's the story that we like to tell. This is what I fell in love with, was just the steel structure. And again, to me it was like this, was like our version of the Roman aqueducts, this sort of industrial ruin. And I read an article in the New York Times that it was going to be torn down, and I sort of thought, everything in New York has a preservation group attached to it. Someone's always working to preserve something. But called around and no one was doing anything with this. But I heard it was on the agenda for a community board meeting. I'd never been to a community board meeting, but went and sat next to another guy who I didn't know at the time. His name was Joshua David. And by the end of the meeting, we realized we were the only two people interested in the project. Most people just didn't care. And then a lot of people there actually really wanted to tear it down. So, like you do, you exchange business cards, and I said, why don't you start something and I can help? And he said, I'm really busy. And I said, well, I'm busier. And so we just said, well, why don't we do something together? And it really was sort of a whim, and neither one of us, I don't think, thought anything would come of it. But we decided we wanted to go up on top of the High Line. So we called up the railroad, CSX, that owns it, and they took us up there, and this is what we found. And as I said, I sort of had fallen in love with the steel structure, but when we came up there, there was 1.5 miles of wildflowers, running right through the middle of the city. And it was this, that's when I really fell in love, was this juxtaposition between sort of the hard and the soft, this natural landscape that completely taken over, this industrial ruin. And so, people assume that we had this grand plan of how we were going to start things. But when we started it, we had no plan, no money, and no relevant experience. A lot of people assume we were planners and architects, but Joshua was a travel writer, and my background was as a part-time painter and worked for some internet startup companies. So, no real background. And the reason I always like to make this point is that when I talk to people that want to start their own projects, they think they have to have those three things. They think they have to have this perfect plan, or any kind of plan. They think they have to have all the relevant experience, and then think they have to have the money, which, Highline is a case in point. You don't need either in the beginning. But one of the first things we did, so we were starting it. We were both sort of working out of our apartments. One of the very first things we did was get a logo. And this was done, Paula Scher at Pentagram did this for us. And one, it made us look like we were more than we were, just two guys. It's funny, I looked at our old business cards that she designed, and it has our home address and home. It has my landline on it. But the other thing is, that I think this was important, is this was a symbol that we were going to use good design all the way through. That if we were able to get this done, we weren't just going to throw a planter and a stair and call it a day. That we were committed to good design. And so not only in our logo, but a lot of the things we did, from our invitations to our websites to our email newsletter, we tried to sort of have it feel a little different than what you would normally see. I'm going back to this picture, because one of the other first things we did is, so we went up there, it was amazing, no one else could see it. We took pictures, they looked sort of crappy, it looks like weeds growing on an elevated rail line. And it wasn't very inspiring. So someone recommended this photographer named Joel Sternfeld, who I looked him up on the internet. He was in information, I called him up. He went up there and he said, okay, don't let anyone up here for a year, and but let me come up here and photograph it for a year, and I'll give you something really great. And he did these photos of the High Line throughout the year. And we published a book called Walking the High Line of these images. And this really helped what captures people's attention, especially this photo. And Josh and I think of Joel as like this third co-founder, because this photo is really what people fall in love with. We found, in presentations, to sort of speak less and sort of show this more. And then people can imagine whatever they want on this. The other thing, whenever I'm talking to people that are starting things, everyone is pressuring them to come up with designs early on. Like, And people would do it to us. Okay, oh, so this is great. What are you going to build? What are you going to do? And instead of doing designs early on, we really focused on this. Because once you start doing designs, people like Adam can start criticizing them and saying, well, what about the sleepers? But if you, with this, some people would see this and think, oh, the horticulture, what amazing, the plants growing up. Some people would say, oh, rail history. Some people would say, it's a great place for architecture. It allows a lot of people to get behind you. And this was, now the High Line's really popular. But at the time, it was pretty unpopular. The mayor, Giuliani, at the time, wanted to tear it down. He signed a demolition order in the last 2 days before he left office. But we found that this was also sort of an asset for us because, if we showed people the pretty picture and they said that I don't care about the pretty picture, we could always say, well, Giuliani hates it. And they would say, oh, then it must be a great idea. I swear a lot of our supporters just liked it because anything that they just, if Giuliani didn't like it, it must be good. The other thing is when we, I thought everything in New York, all projects, big civic projects were done because rich ladies on the Upper East Side, got by. Because that's what you saw in the paper, these rich women on the Upper East Side that, do these parties. And so that's who I thought we needed to get behind it. But they weren't really interested, in this project. And so we ended up going with the people that we knew. And Josh and I are both gay. And so like a lot of our early supporters were just our gay friends. And one of my friends from college who was straight came to one of our very first events. And he was like, wow, there are a lot of men here. And this is a picture of Florent, who had a restaurant on Gansevoort Street, who was a real pioneer in the neighborhood. And every year he would dress up as Marie Antoinette. And so one year he dressed up for Bastille Day as, with the High Line, with the train going around and the bustle. And there's a whole nother talk I won't give, but that we did, that Josh, because there's a lot of interesting things about the gay parts of the High Line. We did a talk at the center called Behind the Bushes, the Secret Homo History of the High Line. So if anybody's interested in that, you can ask me later. So one of the things we did, we knew Giuliani was leaving. So we got all 5 people that were running against him, or running after him, to support it. And it's a great technique. When people are running for office, they'll support almost anything. And Bloomberg was a big supporter. But when he got in office, 9/11 had happened. We were in an economic, calamity. And so his support was a little more shaky. And he didn't really care about the pretty Joel Sternfeld photos. And so we commissioned an economic feasibility study, a guy named John Alschuler at HRNA, to do this study to show that it made economic sense, that it wasn't just about, that this made good economic sense for the city. So we wanted to show that the tax revenues generated over a 20-year time period would be greater than the cost, and that you could actually build the thing. So the best example of parks creating value is Central Park. But we thought, there's no way you could ever compare Central Park to the High Line. So we looked at these small, tiny pocket parks. And if you have an apartment 1 to 2 blocks near there, it increases about 5 to 15% in value. The other thing that we talked to real estate marketers, and they said the real way you create value is to create a neighborhood. So you live in a neighborhood that has a name, a place people want to work in, shop in, live in. And this is actually a map that Paula Scher, who created our logo, did for us to show all the things that the High Line would connect. At the time, West Chelsea wasn't sort of an obvious destination, and so we wanted to show how it could connect the West Village, the meatpacking, and Chelsea. And so we started thinking of the High Line, sort of branding it as a High Line district. And this has come true sort of frighteningly more than we ever thought. And the study came back, and it showed it would cost about $100 million to build, but it would generate about $250 million in direct new tax revenues to the city over a 20-year time period. When you do these studies, you always sort of like, know you're sort of inflating the numbers a little bit probably and a little overly optimistic. Turns out we got both of those numbers wrong. It's cost $150 million to build so far, but the new calculation is that it'll generate about close to $1 billion in tax revenues over a 20-year time period. So it's been a good investment for the city. And you know, we had to fight Giuliani, but this really is an example of a public-private partnership. And not just Mayor Bloomberg, who's been our biggest supporter, but Christine Quinn, Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer. This really has been a partnership with a lot of elected officials, partnering with a private group to make this happen. And I love this photo because none of them are looking at each other. Like, I feel like they learned this, you know, in elected official school. You can stand with them, but you don't have to acknowledge each other. But we were still fighting the property owners. So the railroad just owned the steel structure and a 30-foot easement above the rail bed. But 22 property owners owned property underneath, and they wanted to tear it down. So we looked at, you know, one of the best, New York Central, that was actually built by the Central Railroad, that built the High Line, coincidentally. But, you know, was the site of a huge preservation battle. And, you know, preserving this is what's really started the landmarking movement in New York. But one of the other things it did, it was the first case of a transfer of development rights. The way development rights work in New York is if you own property, you can sell any excess development rights to your neighbor. If your neighbor is already built out or doesn't need them, there's no market for them. So what they let Grand Central do is transfer their development rights anywhere in the neighborhood. That's where there are all those tall buildings around Grand Central. And so that's what we proposed here. They also did it for the theaters in Times Square in the 90s, because they were worth more for their land to build a tall office building for, you know, a 4-story theater. And so that's what we proposed here, and ultimately Amanda Burden at the City Planning Commission did this rezoning. And that's what got the property owners on board. But even in 2003, no one knew what the High Line was. People in the neighborhood had no idea. There was really very little awareness of it. We still had no money. We were still fighting, sort of trying to settle with the property owners. So we did an ideas competition, because we couldn't do a design competition because we didn't own the property. So we had about 750 entries from around the world. And the entries did not have to be realistic. We said you can envision whatever you want. And the goal was for people to think about it in different ways. And this was my favorite entry for many reasons. But it was a mile-long lap pool, you know, that would run. I still think that would have been amazing. And then some people, you know, did sort of, this was what came from Russia, and it was more of a, you know, artistic thought. This one was like a political manifesto that you would have to imprison people in the I-beams of the High Line, and you know, it's like you have to witness the people you're imprisoning. And they too put a pool. I never understood what the pool was, but it's interesting. Juries, I mean, I assume some of y'all will enter competitions at some point. When you look through 720 entries, it becomes mind-numbing, and people love hand-drawn black and white. I swear, this was one of the finalists against I was so nervous people would freak out that we think we were going to build a prison in the High Line. But the jury really liked it, partly because you know, you just get, when you see so much color and computer renderings, seeing hand-drawn black and white works. This, I think, was playing off of High and High Line. And then this one was really interesting because this, when I'll get back to this a little later, was talking about not the design of the High Line, but what happens in and around the High Line. So like the program, that just as important as the design is what happens on it and near it to make it success. And that really is one of the keys to a successful park, not just the design. And this was my other favorite, which was a mile-long urban roller coaster. And you know, the idea you look into people's apartments and then zoom down. And we had the exhibition of all these at Grand Central to make that connection, you know, with the railroad, and also to make people think this wasn't just a. We wanted it to be important to just the neighborhood, but we also didn't want it just to be a local project. That this was important to the whole city, and not just about the neighborhood. So one of the advantages of not being an expert, like, you know, I think if I was an architect, I would have wanted to design it. And one of the beauties is that Josh and I didn't have a specific vision of what it should be. We always said, you know, the city and the neighborhood should help decide what it is. So since we started this in '99, we've had about 24 different community input forums. And this is one of the first postcards we sent out to asking people, like, what did they want to see? And these are just pictures of some of these. And we were doing them last year for Section 3 design. And so, but, you know, so involving people in this process. What happens normally is people go to the community after the design is done, and then they ask for input, but everyone knows the design's already done, and they don't want your input. So before we started designing, we went, and then the most important part is during the design process, we would go back, so that when there's still real room for making changes. So this is, you know, what the High Line looked like, and this was the real challenge is, you know, how do you keep this sort of magical landscape? This is at 14th Street. How do you preserve this, but also open it up to the public? And we really didn't have the answer. This was one of the responses in a community input session. The High Line should be preserved, untouched as a wilderness area. No doubt you will ruin it, so it goes. And I have this above my desk, because this was actually my fear, is that this is beautiful, and we should just keep it like this and never let anyone up there, or just me and my friends. And that and we knew we had to remove everything that was there, because we had to put in new drainage and waterproof it. So we knew we couldn't just leave it as this. So you couldn't leave it untouched. So when you're going to create something new, it's just going to become schlocky. So when we started the design competition, that was a big fear. And we had 4 finalists. This is Zaha Hadid's entry. In the competition interview, I asked, I asked her why she didn't put any trees on the High Line. And she said trees are things that architects put when they don't know what to do with a space. And I love her work, but realized she was not a fit for us. Michael van Valkenburg, who designed Brooklyn Bridge Park, had a really actually amazing entry that was really beautiful. And then the architect Stephen Hall, who had actually been working on the High Line since 1979. His very first project was called Bridge of Houses, which was a design for the High Line. He was really the first architect to think about what to do up there. But his concept was, as you can see, sort of more architectural. And then the winning design was by James Corner Field Operations, who's a landscape firm, with Dillers Caffidio and Renfro and Pete Uldoff. And this is what I love about this picture is this is, you know, very much actually what it looks like. This is from their original competition boards. This is another entry. And their concept was this planking system that could be used in different ways, you know, where you have more gathering spaces and, you know, areas, and then sort of cutting up through the structure. And so this was what we went with, and actually started building in 2007. And this, as you can see, it under construction. We had to remove everything that was there. We put back the tracks, the sleepers, but as Adam pointed out, we did not use the clips. And then the planking, and then the dirt went in. And one of the things you can sort of get in a little idea in this picture is how little planting soil depth there is. It's about 13 inches average up on the High Line. And then one of the things the planking does is create this sort of linear feel. And then in some cases, the planks peel up to form the benches, you know, and the furniture on the High Line. And then the planting was done by Pete Uldoff, who's a Dutch horticulturalist. It's all perennials. So there's no annuals up there. Everything just keeps coming up. And one of the things, I mean, he's famous for the beautiful sort of plants, but also for what plants look like after they're dead. He picks a lot of things, you know, for sort of the fall foliage, but also what they look like, you know, when they're dead. I mean, he has this quote. He said, "Brown is a color too," because everybody's obsessed with, you know, the beautiful colors of flowers or the greens. Another, I think, sort of thing that a lot of people don't notice is the lighting. Was done by a guy named Hervé Descote. He has a firm called L'Observatoire. He specializes in nightclubs and restaurants, and he does some and some museums. But the idea was, normally when you go into a park, you have an overhead light, and you can see, in that cone of light, but you really can't see the plants around you, and you can't see the city around you because your eyes adjust to the light. So his idea was to keep all the lighting low. So we put the lighting in LED lighting in a railing right on the existing railing. So it lights you, the plants, and the pathway, but it's not in your eyes, so you can see the city around you. It's very flattering. Someone said we would have known y'all were gay if just by this kind of lighting design. I think in the Parks Department we had a big fight because we wanted dimmers on. And they said they'd never had to install a dimmer in any public park. But I think it worked. And it really is my favorite time, up there. And right now, we have to close at 5 o'clock because we're solving our problems with some of our lighting because of Hurricane Sandy. But in the summer, we stay open till 11. And it's the most beautiful time. It's also when the fewest tourists are up there. The other thing, to me, one of the things about the design that works is it's structured for people watching. That the design is meant for you, to look at the beautiful plants, but the plants change every, if different flowers come every few weeks, the people are changing constantly. And, that's one of the things that I think the reason people go up there is for the people watching. This is the water feature over the sun deck. And, this is, the idea here is, the High Line goes over 10th Avenue, but rarely you ever get the view of what it looks like over an avenue. So that we removed all this steel, reinforced this structure, put glass in here, took out the steel and put glass to give you that view, over 10th Avenue. One of the things we heard after we finished section 1 was that the people in the community wanted a lawn. So in section 2, we built this peel-up lawn. Now it's the most heavily used lawn per square foot in New York City, which sounds nice, but it means we also have to close it 2 days a week just to let it rejuvenate because it's so well loved. And this was an idea the design team had, was sort of an elevated structure on an elevated structure. This flyover that would go through a canopy of trees between 5th and 26th Street. Here it is being constructed, and there it is right after we open. And these magnolia trees right now you're sort of walking at the canopy. Eventually you'll be sort of walking through the canopy of these trees as they grow. There you can see it. And the High Line used to be covered in advertising. Billboards were all over the High Line. And so the design team wanted to sort of have a cue to that. But instead of framing the advertising, it frames views of the city, and then from the street it frames the people up on the High Line. That's at 26th Street. And then here is called the cutout, where they removed the concrete structure to sort of show the steel that the High Line is built from. And some people don't even notice, but when you're walking over this grating, you can see through it, and so you can see the cars driving under you. Here you can see that shot, through Chelsea. And one of the great, some people, Adam hasn't made this complaint, but other friends have said, why did you let them build this ugly building next to the High Line? But not in this picture. But we don't have any control what people build in the High Line. But the good news is that it has encouraged a lot of interesting development. And there's a spot where you can stand right here at 17th Street and see a building by Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel. This one's now finished by Shigeru Ban, Annabelle Seldorf. This one's now finished, Neil Denari. And then it runs through 3 historic districts. So walking on the High Line, you can see sort of this mix of old and new of New York. And I said it's going to create $1 billion in tax revenues. It's already created, since it opened, about $2 billion in new development. And this number keeps going up every time we need to update this. One of the more interesting projects is also the Whitney, that they're leaving they're going to be renting their current building to the Met, Madison Avenue, and they're going to be moving downtown. It just got topped out, this building, last month, and this is at Gansevoort. And this is our headquarters that's going to be done this summer. The Whitney's going to be done in 2015. It'll be about 3 times as big as the current Whitney space, so it'll really increase their ability to show, especially a lot of their permanent collection, which doesn't get shown. So that'll be our headquarters. And both buildings are designed by Renzo Piano. Oh yeah, there's ours. So what this building does, it gives us another passenger elevator, more bathrooms, a freight elevator. Right now we have to carry everything up and down the stairs to bring anything up on the High Line, in addition to our offices and year-round programming space. So I mentioned Central Park as a great example of parks as an economic generator. But the other example, the other thing that's relevant is a public-private partnership. A lot of people aren't aware, but the Central Park Conservancy, a private group, pays for about 80% of the cost of maintaining Central Park. The High Line, we pay for 95%. So almost everything, every gardener you see up there, this is Johnny, who's one of our gardeners, Judith, one of our custodial staff, at all different seasons, are all our employees, and we don't get any city funding to pay for any of that. The only thing the city pays for is the security. We pay for everything else. And one of the hard parts about, last year it never happened, but when we get snow, we can't use salt. It all has to be removed by hand because the plankings drain into and recycle the water into the planting, which is great in terms of it means less water goes into our sewer system. But the bad news is we can't use salt when it snows. So we thought we would have about 300,000 people a year. That's how many the Whitney or the Guggenheim gets. In 2000, this is actually an old number. We just got the new number. The new number for 2012 is 4.2 million visitors. So just putting it in perspective, it's over 1 million more than MoMA. Now, that's great. It's good for the city. It's good. One of the restaurants nearby said, the recession ended for her the day the High Line opened. But the bad news is, and the things that we worry about, is that does it become just too much for tourists? I'm from San Antonio, where we have the Riverwalk, and people said, oh, do you want the High Line to be like the Riverwalk? And I said, no, because no local would ever go to the Riverwalk. So one of the things we do is a lot of programming, and we gear all of our programs for locals. We could do tours for tourists all day, every day. We only do them once a week, because we gear things to what locals really want or New Yorkers want. And a lot of it, these are just sort of the different kinds of programs. Last year we did over 400 free programs. Everything from a step festival, and we also try to involve not just people from the neighborhood, but from all 5 boroughs. So this was a step festival where teams competed from every borough. Salsa dancing, a lot of kids programs. This is something called the Workyard Kit, where our design teams created this sort of almost like giant Lincoln log set where kids get to build different things. We do this every Wednesday and Saturday during the summer. Then the other thing, people think, everyone assumes Chelsea is a very wealthy neighborhood. But there's actually 2 large low-income NYCHA housing projects in the neighborhood. And about 90% of the kids in the neighborhood are on a lunch program. So it's, it's not a case where gentrification, they're going to be pushed out. So this is a neighborhood of sort of very wealthy and people with a lot of needs. And so one of the things, and a lot of it, they haven't benefited from a lot of the changes in the neighborhood. A lot of their stores have gotten pushed out. Often people don't hire them. And one of the things we heard from them is they felt like they weren't welcome in the High Line. Even though it's free and it's a free public park, they felt, and you hear that a lot from them, a lot of the stores, they feel like they're not welcome. And so we started a community engagement project trying to make them feel welcome, making them part of the park. One of the things that when we asked them, what could we do for you? The number one thing was jobs. So we started a program that we piloted last year called Green Corps, where we gave teenagers where they came and worked on the park during their spring break. Now we're running it throughout the year, and I think we're getting about 60 kids are being a part of that. So one, it's paying them, but it's also giving them exposure to a lot of different kinds of jobs. So we cycle them through all different areas of the Highline, from gardening to our art program to working in the office, and giving them the different kinds of experiences. The other thing that we do for locals, the Highline runs through the Chelsea Art Gallery district, where there's more galleries than anywhere in the world. But it's not particularly, speaking of welcoming, that when you go in a gallery, you often don't feel very welcome. And it's also hard, you don't know which galleries to go to. So we really wanted to bring contemporary art, to the park. So we've developed these 4 different kinds of ways of showing art on the Highline. We have this billboard at 18th Street that every other month we do a different artwork. This is a piece by John Depp Baldessari, a $100,000 bill that we did last Christmas for the holiday season. This was a work that was on the summer. This was a piece that just went up in December. We also show video art at both 22nd Street and at 14th Street. These are down right now, again, because of our power problems, but should be back up next month. This is our only permanent piece, and it is a 720 different panes of glass that were inspired by the colors of the Hudson River. All the other work is temporary and always changing. This is a work by Sarah Z, this sort of stylized bird feeder that was one of our most popular pieces that went left this summer. This is my favorite piece. We have a great art curator, and people kept saying, what giant work of art are you going to do on the Highline? So she did a show called Lilliput of tiny little sculptures that you sort of find hidden, and this guy's name is Carson. Next, this spring, she's doing a new group show called Busted, and it's the idea of busts that you see in parks, sort of military heroes and things like this, but sort of a contemporary version, and that's going to come out this summer. This is the largest work that we've ever done by a Nigerian board artist named El Natsui. And this is between 21st and 22nd, just went up. And it's made from recycled vegetable graters that he collected in dumps in Ghana, where he lives now. And there's a great, on our website, if you go to, and you can, we have a Twitter for Highline Art. We're on Twitter and Facebook. There's a great video of the installation of this. And the hurricane hit halfway through. And in the time lapse, you see it get really dark and stormy. But one of the great, this was sort of unharmed in the storm. So the Highline's not done. The Highline right now ends right there. But there's a whole nother third at the rail yards. And this is the largest, last undeveloped site in Manhattan. And it goes from 30th all the way around. That's the Javits Center at 34th Street. And this is where they were going to put the Olympic Stadium. If we were competing with London. London won, but we were going to have a giant stadium. That was also going to be a Jets football stadium. When that lost, the city put this out to bid, and the Related Companies, which is a large developer in New York, is going to own this. They're going to build 12 million square feet of development here. So to put that in perspective, it's like all the Class A office space in downtown Houston times 2 is going to be right here. It's going to be the densest area of Manhattan. They just started construction on the first building. It's going to be right here. It's going to be a headquarters for the Coach, the leather goods. It's going to be, I think, 70 stories, about 1.2 million square feet. A lot of development. So it's funny. Right now, people think of this as the afterthought. I think everything's happening in Chelsea. This is going to be a whole new neighborhood. It's like Rockefeller Center built there. The other thing that's going to change things is the first new subway in 70 years is going to come out right here. It's going to open maybe at the end of this year or early next year. So the end of the High Line will be right next to this new number 7 entry. So when we were looking at the designs, one of the things people love to do on rail lines is walk on the rails. And we have rails right now in the planking and in the planting, but there wasn't a place to actually walk on it. So we're building this rail walk on the rail yards. So right now we have these two kind of benches you saw in the photos, but they're coming up with sort of different concepts. Like here's an X bench where section 2 meets section 3 at the rail yards. The super long bench, this picnic bench, I think it looks sort of like this, the Star Trek Enterprise a little bit. This is going to be a sort of a seesaw bench. The planting, like section 1 is 2, it's by Pete Uldoff. So it's all different plants, but it has sort of the similar kind of palette of, I asked him one time, I said, do you think of this as a natural landscape? And he said, there's really nothing natural about it. It's idealized nature. And that's, we definitely find that it takes a lot of work to make it look wild. And then where the High Line, this is where the High Line goes over 11th Avenue. And so the idea of creating this sort of raised catwalk, so it gives you a little higher right when you're over 11th Avenue, so you can see up and down the street, but then we're putting seating on the side, so it creates just sort of this voyeuristic thing of sort of like almost just watching people walk on the catwalk with the planting on the side. And then we had a lot of people say they wanted something for kids. They wanted a playground. And so we didn't want to just throw up a swing set up there. So the design team came up with this idea of exposing the structure and coating it in like a soft rubberized play surface. And so we're calling these sort of the play beams. And so it's something that I think adults will be just as interested in as kids. And they're just still finalizing these. They're also designing something called the gopher hole, where you'll be able to go in a little hole and then pop up in the middle of the planting bed. They have it in gopher at zoos, you can like go in and come up in the gopher area. So, oh, there you can see. We're still working how it's actually going to work. But, and then, some of these will be on pivots, so you can actually turn them. And then we don't have enough money. So this is this section. We don't actually have enough money to fully build this out. So remember how I said you couldn't leave the High Line as is because it has to be renovated? But we said, well, you could leave it like that for 5 or 10 years. So this part in red we're going to fully build out with these designs I just showed you. So it'll look sort of like section 1 and section 2 with different features. But this orange part we're going to leave as is. And we're just going to put a walkway over it. And so it gives people the chance to experience that same landscape that Josh and I first saw in 1999. And this is the part I'm actually most excited about. Partly because it'll feel so different than the rest of the line. Also because it won't be permanent. Eventually, we're going to have to go in and rip it out and redo it because otherwise the structure won't stand. You need to do drainage, all this kind of remediation. But for 5 or 10 years, people will be able to experience this sort of wildscape. We broke ground last fall, and so we hope to open this new section in 2014. If you want to know more, Josh and I wrote a book called The High Line, The Inside Story of New York City's Park in the Sky, if you're curious about more. And happy to answer any questions.
Yep. How did you get Polisher to do the logo?
I was working for, yeah.
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, so she asked how we got Paula Scher to do the logo. And Paula Scher is a famous graphic designer. She does a lot for BAM, for the Public Theater. She did the City Core logo with the umbrella. But I was hired to start an internet division for a watch retailer called Watch World. And they had a really crappy logo. And so I convinced them that we needed to redo their logo. And I'd always walked by the Pentagram office and wanted to go in. So I called the receptionist, and they got me a meeting with Paula Scher. So she was pitching business for us to hire her to do the logo. And so I went up afterwards and said, oh, I'm starting this nonprofit. So she did the logo, she said, to try to get the business for the Watch World. And then Watch World got bought by Sunglass Hut and never did any. She never got any business. But, and then she subsequently really fell in love with the project and has done all of she's done all the signage on the High Line, and she designed our book. So, but she said, I think she had more faith in it than we did. She said, when we designed this, this is not meant to be your logo. This is meant to be the logo of the actual park when you're done. And we were like, whatever. Be true. Anybody else? Yep.
Where is the money from?
That's a very, very good question. So it cost about $150 million to build what we've opened right now, Section 1 and Section 2. About $100 million of that came from the city and the federal government. Because we're a Rails to Trails project, we qualified for transportation funding, and you hear about pork, all these and appropriations. We got $20 million of that pork before they stopped doing it, so some went to good use. And then the city put up the majority of the money. We raised $50 million privately, from individuals. Barry Diller and Furstenberg are our biggest donors. They've given $30 million to the project. But now our budget is about $5 million to run the park, and we raise all that privately. Members, you can become a member for $40, which is, and major gifts, foundations, but mostly is from individuals. So that's one of the challenges, is we're constantly having to raise money. We are trying to diversify our income. We're going to be opening. We're opening a restaurant underneath the High Line at Gansevoort. We sell, the most common question our gardeners are asked are, can I buy your t-shirt and what's that plant? So we started selling t-shirts with the High Line logo on it. And we have some food vendors. We make a little bit of money, but it was one of the biggest complaints when we opened. When you do research on what's the #1 activity in parks, it's not exercise, it's eating. And it's hot up there and people want something to drink and get something to eat. So 2 years ago, we started having some food vendors up there. Last year, we opened a little wine bar by Terroir at 15th Street, which is popular. It earns a little bit of revenue, but it's also just sort of an amenity for the park. But that's our biggest challenge, and it's one of the things that it's hard. A lot of people all over the country come to the High Line as an example, and especially a lot of mayors and cities as a great example of public-private partnerships. Sometimes it makes me a little nervous because ultimately I think, parks should be the responsibility of cities. I mean, that's to me why we pay taxes. So there's an interesting tension of, the good news is because we're paying for it, the city can use this money in parks and neighborhoods that otherwise wouldn't be able to raise it privately. But there is brings up an interesting question. Did someone, yeah.
Yeah, so thanks so much for coming, and the High Line is just such an incredible project. I remember reading about it in architecture school in 2003 in Metropolis or something in New Zealand and being like, wow, this is insane, I moved to New York. But, so you were saying before that you were a painter and you sort of worked for this watch company. Where was the point where you transitioned into taking this on full time? Because, yeah, I mean, the complexity of it's immense.
Yeah. So for a long time, Josh and I, it was just sort of a hobby. We hired our first employee. We were still working. He was a travel writer. That Watch World got bought off by Sunglass Hut. I made a little money. I didn't work for a year and just focused, thought I was gonna go, travel, but instead just started working on the High Line. Then when that money ran out, I started doing consulting to sort of, pay my bills so I could spend more time on this. But it was really a gradual thing. One of the benefits, one of the things that made it easier for me is I really didn't think this thing was gonna happen. Like I said, Paula Scher had more faith. I mean, I'm definitely a dreamer, or I wouldn't do this, but I'm also a realist. And so knew the chances of it actually happening were very low. So in some ways that was a little freeing in that it wasn't like all my eggs were in this basket. I sort of assumed it probably was going to ultimately fail at some point, or it would take 20 or 30 years to get it done. So, for me, one of the reasons I kept doing it, because every year I'd sort of make this mental calculus, does this make sense for me to invest this time? And why it was worthwhile, even if it failed, was I was working with all these interesting people. Like Paula Scher, and designers, and architects, and planners, like people I would never have gotten to meet and talk to, on my own. And so that's one of the things when I always telling people when they, are worried about starting something, is you learn so much, even if it doesn't, even if it doesn't happen. And then gradually it slowly transitioned into, and I also resisted it because I was like, this isn't a real career. Now it's like an amazing job, but I was like, I was more fixated on sort of for-profit jobs. Running a business is a real job, not an elevated park. It's just not a real job. And so it took me a long time, and finally it was just like, this is better than any real job. This is more interesting than just a regular job. So.
The park is clearly a success and a huge, magnetic attraction, and you hear everybody talk about it. I'm curious, when you make a claim that the park is responsible for like $2 billion in economic development, how do you measure that versus, part of me is like, wasn't that going to happen anyway in New York City?
That's a great question. So why are you getting credit for the $2 billion? So there's two numbers I put out tonight. One was $2 billion in new development. So that's just looking at how much construction has happened since the High Line opened. So that's a pretty easy number. Yes, that would have, and we get too much credit and too much blame for everything in Chelsea. People say you're responsible for everything good and everything bad that happens, in Chelsea. But the actual economic benefit is a more scientific number. So what you do is, and this firm HRNA, this is a lot of what they spend their time doing, is they look at properties of comparable size and relative comparable value, and what are they selling for that are near the High Line and away from the High Line. And so they use that as what is the difference. So normally, the closer you are to the subway, the more valuable your property. So technically, things on 7th Avenue and 8th Avenue should be more valuable. So they look at a comparable sized apartment there versus the High Line, and they use that. When they were doing it, they were just guessing. Now they really have real numbers of what the value. Then they look at tourism dollars, and they have this bizarre calculation that if a tourist comes, the High Line, and they spend 30 minutes, they add that, so that's like people's stay is 0.001 longer, but added up. Yeah. And then spending on how much that they're spending extra by staying that long. And then looking at all the things that definitely wouldn't, the Whitney would have never happened in the neighborhood. All of the stores, the retail traffic that's increased by that number of visitors. So they have a model that they use to create it. So it's not, and we didn't take advantage of that the area was going to be, we knew it was going to be rezoned residential. So we're trying, we want to publish that study because it's actually interesting. So we're actually looking at trying to publish that so can people see how it do it. Because one of the things I think it's helpful is for people to always make that economic case for parks projects or cultural projects. Because, some people love the pretty pictures or the story, but, other people, the economic is really, an important piece.
Yeah, in one of our classes last semester, the class with Mark Hurst actually, he talked about building consensus. So if the city and the communities are so against this project initially, how, other than this economic feasibility study, how did you go about building consensus with these people to get this built?
Yeah. I mean, again, now the Highline is very popular, but it took us 4 years to get the community board to vote in favor of it, and the head of Preservation and Planning Committee voted against it in that year. And I think, you know, one of the reasons people didn't like it is, to them, it was a reminder they lived in a crappy neighborhood. I mean, to me, that sounds so romantic, a train running through your neighborhood. But it was actually a nightmare. It was loud, it was dirty, it was, you know, it really wasn't romantic. And to them, it was sort of a symbol for a lot of people that it wasn't great. The other thing is, a lot of people said, well, it's a great idea, but it's never going to happen. So you're just sort of postponing the inevitable. You know, let this neighborhood move on from this history and sort of move forward without it. Because they saw Josh and I, and I mean, you know, they weren't crazy. I mean, they were like, how are these two guys going to get this done? So one of the things we did was you just keep showing up, you know, and start building and finding groups, you know, that supported you. And again, like a lot of our supporters were gay. A lot of them were young business owners that had moved to the neighborhood. The art galleries were big supporters, you know, that were sort of willing. I think art galleries didn't care if it was crazy or never happened. They just thought it was an interesting project. And then the other group was young people. My board chair pointed out that that when I started this, I was thought of as like a young person starting this project, and now at 43, I no longer am in that category. But when we started this, you know, it was like our friends, and the average age of the community board, one person that opposed it on the community board said, I love what you're doing, not because of the project, but you're bringing new people into this process. Because the average age of the community board would drop like 2 decades when we were on the agenda, because we were bringing new people, you know, into this, you know, into the discussion. And the things like the ideas competition, always when people are starting things, it gets daunting because you think of the end goal and you're never going to get there, and how am I going to get there? Where the hell would I ever get $150 million? And you know, it just, so is breaking it down into small little pieces, like get a logo. Then you get a logo and you've accomplished that. One of the first things we did was print a brochure. We had to raise $5,000. We sent an email around to all of our friends asking them for $100. And then, that, you know, then we had a logo. Then we had a brochure. Then we had to file a lawsuit. Then we did an ideas competition. You know, so it's just these little pieces. But each one of those brings people along, and it gives them some level of confidence. Because we didn't say, okay, judge me whether I get the Highline built in 10 years. They were like, judge me whether I can get this brochure done, whether we can pull off an ideas competition, whether we can pull off an event. You know, each one sort of builds people's trust.
First, I just want to say thank you. I was around, like I remember reading about this when I was in college, and I really wanted to get involved, but I was in Westchester, and so it was kind of, I couldn't, but I actually I studied set design, and I set one of my plays on the Highline, because I wasn't brave enough to actually climb up and get on the set. My imagination, I created it. But I was wondering, what do you think about the low line? 2 guys, crazy idea, also bringing the park. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I love the low line. I mean, we've been talking to them for 2 years now. And one of the things, a lot of people come to us with wanting help or wanting sort of ideas. And I can always tell the ones that say, oh, we want it to be just like the Highline, are the ones that won't work. The ones that I think are interesting are ones that have their own idea and own concept. And you know, I think the low line, so much of what it's about is sort of a technology, using not revolutionary I mean, fiber optic cables, I don't know how long they've been around, a long time, but you know, using them to light this interior space is, I think, a really interesting idea, and can have a lot, you know, applications outside of the low line. So I'm really, you know, excited, and they're doing all of the right things. You know, it's now their next challenge is getting the MTA. The MTA owns the property. And so they want to bid it out. So their next challenge is getting the MTA to either give it to them, or for them to partner with developers so they can give enough money for the MTA to pass it on.
I would also just thank you for sharing your story. It's amazing. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about sustainability and environmental impact and the type of thing that you encountered and the type of thing you'd like to either have an impact on the environment in the neighborhood, and how you guys think about that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's something we think a lot about. You know, people always ask all the time, is this a LEED building? And one of the biggest ironies is, you know, renovations, or when you retrofit, it can't be LEED. I mean, it's a new building, which is inherently the most inefficient and environmentally, you know, damaging is building anything new. Even, I mean, our new headquarters will be LEED. But, you know, the most efficient way to do anything is to use what was there. You know, I mean, that was one of the arguments we made, and how much energy and how much money it would cost. We think it would have cost almost $60 million to tear down the thing, you know, to build it. And so that's, you know, at the core, you know, this is just sort of a giant act of recycling. And then the other thing, I was talking a little bit about the planting. One of the big issues, we're getting at more, is, you know, stormwater drainage. When normally all of our, you know, sewage is treated, but in storms it overloads the sewage and they just, you know, put it out into the water. So one of the things, you know, cities are looking to do is to reduce that. So that's one of the reasons that only about 20% of the water goes into the, you know, the sewage system, because most of it goes back into the planting. Having them all be perennials. We don't have to, we're not replanting the highline. You know, when you go to some parks and it's all tulips, those tulips have to be planted every year, and then you rip them out and put in a new planting. You know, these are all perennials. They take a lot of work to maintain. So in that way, I had this fantasy, because you're planting all perennials, it'll be really cheap to maintain. It takes a lot of work to keep the mix, because what would normally happen is certain plants would take over everything. So you're constantly working on that. The other thing is we try to use minimal, I mean, the first 2 years we used no pesticides. We started, all of our trees started getting a rot, and it was a big issue for us whether we use pesticides. And, you know, we talked to a lot of people, you're going to have to replace more plants more often if you didn't use. So in certain areas, last year we used minimal, you know, pesticides. So those are the kind of sort of the give and take, you know, that we sort of have to look at. But to me, the thing that I think the biggest impact the Highline can have in terms of the environment is to inspire, you know, when we started this, I felt like the people that cared about the Highline were the Japanese, the Dutch, the Germans, Italians, because they had, I think, a better sense of sort of reusing industrial infrastructure, whereas I think America, you know, so much of a good thing is if it's old, you tear it down and build something new. So I think the most lasting impact that we could have, or the environmental impact, is to inspire other people of how you can reuse, you know, existing industrial infrastructure. I mean, there's no more, you know, farmland in cities to build parks. So you're going to be doing it on old industrial sites. And so rather than just trying to clear them and build sort of a central, you know, a central park, this like, you know, bucolic countryside, you know, incorporating that industrial history, but it also makes environmental sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. There was one of the slides had band performance, or not band performance, but highlight performance, and you mentioned band. Is there any sort of like more traditional performance, whether it's dance or a venue or anything? You mentioned the Whitney's moving there.
Yeah.
Ideas of that happen?
Well, I mean, one of the things, it's a linear park, so it's really hard to have big groups. But we did experiment with salsa dancing. It's been really popular, so we do that once a month in the summer. We've done, when we do performances, we've had like moving bands, you know, that move throughout the park. Because it's a problem, we just can't, we can do some at the 10th Avenue Square. There's a spot that we're looking at in the rail yards that we haven't designed yet where it goes over 10th Avenue. We're actually looking at maybe doing a performance spot there. We also do movies up there, but again, like the max that we can have is 300 people. So we can't do like a PS1 kind of event up there. But it works with the right, especially with the right people. It can be a really interesting because it's a different way of experiencing it rather than just sitting, having it move instead of the people move around.
I think we have time for maybe one, maybe two more questions.
You get a lot of requests to allow dogs.
Yes. Joshua, the other co-founder, owns 2 dogs, and it was a source of huge fights when we were opening. What ultimately settled it was, again, the water issue where I was talking about salt. So the reason we can't put salt is if you put the salt in, it'll migrate into the planting. The same thing with dog urine. Dog urine's really toxic for plants. So even if they don't pee on the plants, if they pee in here and then the rain comes and it'll carry it into the planting, and which can be a problem in any park, but you normally have a lot of soil. We only have 13 inches of soil. And so it would have proven to be very toxic for the plants. We thought we were going to get a lot more complaints. We actually got a few letters from dog owners that say they like it because then they go up there and they don't have to bring their dog. But and it's been so popular and crowded that it really works without. But and when we first opened, it was provisional. We were just going to see how it went the first year, but now we've made that permanent. But it's interesting because the rules. Someone brought a cat up there, and they tried to get them to leave, but they pointed out the sign just says no dogs. It doesn't say no animals. So, last question.
How do you envision the Highline, say, 20 years from now?
Yeah, I hope it just keeps changing. Actually, I have one more slide that I didn't talk about. This is one of my favorite things, is that when we opened section 1, we misdirected the lighting, and it shone into this woman's apartment, into her bedroom. And she called to complain, but we were so busy, we didn't deal with it. And she called again and complained. And then, like any good New Yorker, she made the best of it. She got a friend who was a cabaret singer to serenade the people on the High Line from her, fire escape. And she started doing it every week, and it was called the High Line Renegade Cabaret. And ultimately, she's in a rent-controlled apartment, and her landlord wanted to kick her out, so they sicked the fire department because that's not a proper use of fire escape. So she had to stop doing it. But to me, that's one of the things that I loved, is how the High Line was a mistake. I mean, it was an elevated rail line that really didn't even work that long, and then it was unused, and now we're using it for something else. The lighting on her apartment was a mistake. It's not how you're supposed to use fire escapes. And just sort of re-envisioning it, and that's what I hope keeps happening. And the High Line design's probably going to stay roughly the same. That's why I think our programming is so important, that keeps developing and changing in the art programming. So it's always something, so we're coming up with different ways to do performances, on the High Line. There's different kids programming. There's different kinds of art, that doesn't even just have to be on the High Line, but around the neighborhood. So, that would be my dream.
So it won't be a swimming pool after all?
I don't know. I wish. Maybe.
What about urban agriculture? Is that something that you talked about? Is that people having plots for food or doing pilot programs?
Yes.
See if there's ways to use it for creating community assets?
When I die. I hate that idea. Yes, every day. My ex-boyfriend used to propose it to me all the time. That's not why we broke up. But we have people in the office that, are the woman that runs our food program wants to do it. And that's why I think as soon as I leave, it'll happen. But the reason I don't like it is I think it's just so small and it's so limited. And I just think there's other places that are better suited where you can have a more scale, for it. And so I just don't think every park has to have it. And I just, so that's my personal. But yes, a lot of people, and it's one of the things that I bet will happen.
We want to thank Robert for coming.
There was 1.5 miles of wildflowers, running right through the middle of the city. And it was that's when I really fell in love, was this juxtaposition between sort of the hard and the soft, this natural landscape that completely taken over, this industrial ruin. And so, people assume that we had this grand plan of how we were going to start things. But when we started it, we had no plan, no money, and no relevant experience. A lot of people assume we were planners and architects, but Joshua was a travel writer, and my background was as a part-time painter and worked for some internet startup companies. So, no real background. And the reason I always like to make this point is that when I talk to people that want to start their own projects, they think they have to have those 3 things. They think they have to have this perfect plan or any kind of plan. They think they have to have all the relevant experience, and then think they have to have the money, which, Highline is a case in point. You don't need either in the beginning. But one of the first things we did, so we were starting it. We were both sort of working out of our apartments. One of the very first things we did was get a logo. And this was done, Paula Scher at Pentagram did this for us. And one, it made us look like we were more than we were, just 2 guys. It's funny, I looked at our old business cards that she designed, and it has our home address and home. It has my landline on it. But the other thing is that I think this was important, is this was a symbol that we were going to use good design all the way through. That if we were able to get this done, we weren't just going to throw a planter and a stair and call it a day. That we were committed to good design. And so not only in our logo, but a lot of the things we did, from our invitations to our websites to our email newsletter, we tried to sort of have it feel a little different than what you would normally see. I'm going back to this picture because one of the other first things we did is, so we went up there, it was amazing, no one else could see it. We took pictures, they looked sort of crappy, it looks like weeds growing on an elevated rail line. And it wasn't very inspiring. So someone recommended this photographer named Joel Sternfeld, who I looked him up on the internet. He was in information. I called him up. He went up there, and he said, "Okay, don't let anyone up here for a year, and but let me come up here and photograph it for a year, and I'll give you something really great." And he did these photos of the High Line throughout the year, and we published a book called Walking the High Line of these images. And this really helped what captured people's attention, especially this photo. And Josh and I think of Joel as like this 3rd co-founder, because this photo is really what people fall in love with. We found, in presentations, to sort of speak less and sort of show this more, and then people can imagine whatever they want on this. The other thing, whenever I'm talking to people that are starting things, everyone is pressuring them to come up with designs early on, and people would do it to us. Okay, oh, so this is great. What are you going to build? What are you going to do? And instead of doing designs early on, we really focused on this. Because once you start doing designs, people like Adam can start criticizing them and saying, well, what about the sleepers? But with this, some people would see this and think, oh, the horticulture, what amazing, the plants growing up. Some people would say, oh, rail history. Some people would say, it's a great place for architecture. It allows a lot of people to get behind you. And this was, now the High Line's really popular, but at the time it was pretty unpopular. The mayor, Giuliani, at the time wanted to tear it down. He signed a demolition order in the last 2 days before he left office. But we found that this was also sort of an asset for us because, if we showed people the pretty picture and they said that I don't care about the pretty picture, we could always say, well, Giuliani hates it. And they would say, oh, then it must be a great idea. I swear out ground. And so that's how they built Riverside Park, was over those train lines. And if you take the Empire Line to Albany today, you're going on those same tracks that the High Line used to run on. So here it is running through what was then the old Bell Labs building, what's now West Beth. So you can see, now it no longer goes this. You can still see this little piece that's still there. And this part was demolished in the 90s. That's now the West Coast building. Those little holes where the trains used to run through are now apartments. But with the rise of interstate trucking, it was used less and less. And the last train was a trainload of frozen turkeys at Thanksgiving in 1980, or that's the story that we like to tell. This is what I fell in love with, was just the steel structure. And again, to me, it was like this, was like our version of the Roman aqueducts, this sort of industrial ruin. And I read an article in the New York Times that it was going to be torn down, and I, sort of thought, everything in New York has a preservation group attached to it. Someone's always working to preserve something. But called around and no one was doing anything with this. But I heard it was on the agenda for a community board meeting. I'd never been to a community board meeting, but went and sat next to another guy who I didn't know at the time. His name was Joshua David. And by the end of the meeting, we realized we were the only two people interested in the project. Most people just didn't care. And then a lot of people there actually really wanted to tear it down. So, like you do, you exchange business cards, and I said, why don't you start something and I can help? And he said, I'm really busy. And I said, well, I'm busier. And so we just said, well, why don't we do something together? And it really was sort of a whim, and neither one of us, I don't think, thought anything would come up of it. But we decided we wanted to go up on top of the High Line. So we called up the railroad, CSX, that owns it, and they took us up there, and this is what we found. And as I said, I sort of had fallen in love with the steel structure, but when we came up there, the trains used to run down 10th Avenue, and it was called Death Avenue because so many people were run over, if you can just imagine what this looked and smelled like, and the train, running over people, that the railroad, New York Central, hired a guy on horseback to ride in front of the train, and he got nicknamed the West Side Cowboy. And this is a picture taken in 1934. You can see the track had just been built. This is at 17th and 10th Avenue. But I don't know if the cowboy wasn't that good or it just didn't work, but about one person was still killed every month. So they decided to elevate it, and this is a picture of it under construction. This is on 30th Street. This is the old Miller Highway, which was where the West Side Highway is. It was elevated. And this was torn down in the 80s. This was still here. And so there were these two sort of steel structures, one for cars, one for trains. And they were built almost at the same time. Here's a great picture with the Empire State Building. The Empire State Building was finished at the same time the High Line was. So, sometimes I think of the High Line as so old and it's this industrial artifact, but really, it's my dad's age. So it's ancient for industrial history, but it's not sort of an ancient artifact of New York. So here's a picture right after it was completed, running through Chelsea. So this is where the old Roxy was. This is the kitchen, London Terrace. You can still see, again, the trains running down 10th Avenue. And it was always a freight train. It was never a passenger train or an L. And it originally ran all the way down to Houston Street. And it serviced a lot of the warehouses along the way. This building was the old R.C. Williams. This is now the Avenues School. It's the new school. That was actually the first building that got something loaded from the High Line. And it was elevated partly because to load and unload in this industrial area, but also because this area was built on landfill. The rail line continued north, and above 34th Street, it went underground.
So thanks, Robert, for coming to do this. I was thinking about how I would introduce him, and I brought these two things into the studio. And basically, if I was to think of my friendship with Robert, it would be these things. For the uninitiated, these are railway clips. They clip rails to sleepers. And why do these remind me or symbolize our friendship? I had a preview tour of phase 1 of the High Line, so from Gansevoort to 23rd Street, the first one, right? 20th. And anyway, you know, I was with my husband, and Robert was like, "So what do you think?" You know, being British, the emotional spectrum is 0 to 0.5. So I was like, "Yeah, it's okay. I mean, you did a good job." And I said, "It lacks a little authenticity." He was like, "What do you mean?" I said, "The rails aren't clipped to the sleepers." And ever since then, he has not let me forget it. So every year I get one of these mailed to me. I know what it is. So my advice is just be careful what you say to Robert, because he will never forget. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm very sensitive, so be careful on the Q&A. Thanks, Adam, for having me. What I thought I'd do is go through a little bit of the history of the High Line, talk a little bit about how we sort of turned this, what was then maybe a crazy idea, into reality, and then talk about sort of the future, where we're going forward. One, we're not done, and there's a lot of other things that we're focused on right now. So, I mean, y'all all know the High Line, so I'm going to go really quickly through the parts y'all know. You know, it's a 1.5 mile rail line on the west side of Manhattan. But what you might not have known is the history. So the train